Don't mind the static. So welcome everyone. This is the first of 2 nights of the Kootenay Boundary Medical Cannabis Conference 2015. And this is particularly going over some of the basics of medical cannabis. And when we talk about basics, we're not talking about remedial information. It's the foundational information everyone needs to know inside and out before you move on to more detailed information and before you understand what's happening in your mind and body when you're treating yourself under doctor's supervision or recommendation with medical cannabis in any variety of it, all of its forms. So tonight is very important, and I'm glad you're all here. We have a wonderful speaker here tonight. I'm going to introduce him shortly. Just to let everyone know, this particular conference is designed to help educate and stimulate discussion in the community and beyond. It is being filmed for posterity. This will be available on YouTube, and I think it's What's Up GF?
Yep.
Yeah, you can get that off Google, right off the net. So in any case, we'll start off. My name is Jim Leslie. I'm one of the directors of the Kootenay's Medicine Tree, and we are a local medical cannabis dispensary, and we've been in business basically since about August 2014. We opened our doors. One of our primary functions beyond giving access to these products is supportive information, education, and science. These are the foundations of this type of therapy. And it's a very patient-involved type of therapy. People are keeping track of what they're taking, how it makes them feel, they're journaling. And this isn't always the case in medicine. A lot of the time we give up our power to pharmaceutical medicine and physicians. And in this case, we're seeing more of our participatory aspect to treating chronic and terminal illness. So on behalf of myself, Marvin Wires, and Wendy Briscoe, the 3 directors of the Kootenay's Medicine Tree, we'd like to welcome you all here, and welcome Rob Callaway, who's standing to my left. Now, pardon me for reading off, but Rob has quite a list of accomplishments, and he is a gifted speaker, and we're very lucky to have him here today. He's coming to us from Kelowna. Rob has a master's degree in psychology and health. Now, he was part of and initiated the largest study to date in Canada, looking at the reasons for using medical cannabis, the amounts that people use, and the barriers to access that they face. As well, he was part of setting up one dispensary, working in another. He has vast experience in talking to members of dispensaries regarding their use of medical cannabis, the different products, the different cannabinoid profiles. As well, Rob's been involved in something called the Herb Museum. And if anyone's familiar with CCHQ, Mark Emery's store, Mark and Jody Emery, West Hastings 307 block, within that building, I think it was on the 2nd floor, there was a herb museum, and this was basically a museum dedicated to medicinal plants like cannabis and opium and the coca plant, natural occurring psychedelics, all used for medicinal purposes. So Rob has a vast history in looking at medicinal plants and their application. So, and prior to all of this, he started out working with at-risk youth and males facing and recovering from drug addiction. So he is well qualified to speak on this topic, and I'd like to welcome him here today. Big round of applause for Rob Callaway.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks for the introduction. Hopefully I do you guys proud. I'm going to just get right into it. So first things first. First, I just want to recognize that we are currently on unceded Kootenay territory, and basically this means that the land was acquired not through treaty, and it was not surrendered either. Yeah. I want to thank everyone for coming and showing your support, and just showing up to something like this. Although it may not seem like it, it does make a difference, so thank you for that as well. And obviously a big thank you to Jim Leslie for putting this together. Many of you may be aware that he's gone through some trials and tribulations with his dispensary, and so we're here to help him out, as well as people in need. So we're going to jump right into it. First of all, what is cannabis? Cannabis is a plant that belongs to the Cannabaceae family. And the Cannabaceae family includes 11 genera, approximately 11 genera, 11 kinds of different flowering plants. And of course, cannabis and humulus, or hops, are the two most well known. Obviously, we all know about cannabis in here, and most people have heard of hops. And that's because hops is a natural preservative and flavoring for beer. This is a picture of a typical cannabis flower, and this is a picture of a typical hops flower. An interesting aspect about cannabis is that it produces both a male and a female flower. And another interesting aspect is that, unlike a lot of flowers, the cannabis plant is pollinated by wind rather than insects. And this is important because the male plant produces the pollen that fertilizes the female plant. And you may have heard of a word called sinsemilla. Sinsemilla is Spanish for without seed. And in essence, this is the separation of the male plants from the female plants in order to stimulate the production of the compounds in the plant that we're looking for. If the female plant does not get pollinated, it basically starts producing more and more of the compounds. And this is why we separate the males from the females. How old is the cannabis plant? Interestingly enough, the best available evidence strongly suggests that it is about 34 million years. So the plant has been on the planet for a very, very long time. And this is a very important thing to remember for later. So just keep in mind, cannabis plant, 34 million years old. Where does cannabis come from? Originally, it comes from two main regions of the world, India and Central Asia. Central Asia being comprised of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Turkestan. A very interesting question, and it's actually quite controversial, is how many species of species of cannabis there are. Now, this has always been controversial. When Linnaeus, who is the father of the system that we use for naming all forms of life on the planet, he was the one who named the cannabis plant. He was of the opinion that there was one species. And this actually permeated academic circles for centuries. There's debate back and forth, and it wasn't until roughly the 1970s, there's one of the main aspects of why it's difficult to determine how many species there are, is that there's no clear line that delineates one species from another. And it wasn't until the 1970s that 3 species were largely accepted as belonging to the cannabis family. And controversial because there was quite a bit of research that went on to suggest that there were these 3 different species, but some botanists were of the opinion that they were mistaken. However, the 3 generally agreed upon species are sativa, indica, and ruderalis. And they can be differentiated from one another by size, along with a few other things, which I'm going to talk about in a few moments. One of the things they can be differentiated by are their leaves. The sativa plant grows thin, serrated leaves as opposed to the indica plant, which grows these much broader, serrated leaves. But the truth of the matter is that most plants are hybrids. They're a mix of one or the other, which we usually call sativa or indica dominant. And an interesting aspect about the difference between how they grow is light versus dark period. So when a plant is young, it requires a lot of sunlight. And when they're growing in nature, this gets it into vegetation and gets it going. But what produces the plants and the flowers and the resin that contains the drug compounds is the change in season to a longer dark period. And this is important because ruderalis, that smallest plant, is a wild type species that was first talked about in Russia. And an interesting aspect about the ruderalis plant, at least some of them, is that they don't produce their flowers dependent on the change in darkness versus light. So they will, in any condition of light, produce flowers depending on how long they've been growing. And it's called autoflowering. And they have, most recently in the last few years, gained a pretty big resurgence because they've been hybridized with the sativa and the indica plants in order to produce a plant that you don't have to tend to as much. So they're easier to grow, and although the ruderalis plants themselves often don't produce very much of the compounds we're talking about, over time, selective breeding, they've been able to incorporate the resin-producing aspects of sativa and indica along with the autoflowering aspect of the ruderalis. But this is where it's going to get complicated. Sativa and indica, those terms have been widely adopted and accepted all over the world by medical users, by recreational users, obviously by pop culture, but they've also been adopted by botanists and other scientists. However, new science is actually beginning to tell us a completely different story. And not everyone's going to like it, and it may not be largely embraced despite the evidence, or if it is embraced, it's going to take quite a bit of time because we've had quite a bit of time with the sativa and indica names. And here is where it gets crazy. In 2014, so just last year at a conference, it was proposed that the names of the plant should actually be changed. So if you look up to the top, I guess on your left, the plant that was formerly Cannabis sativa should actually be called Cannabis indica. And I'm going to talk about why this is probably most likely the case in a moment. At any rate, Cannabis indica because it comes from India. What used to be Cannabis indica should actually be called Cannabis afghanica because it originates in Afghanistan. And the last plant that was Cannabis ruderalis should be Cannabis sativa. And here's why. Jeffrey Guy, another researcher, and Jeffrey Guy is an important name to remember because he is one of the world's leading authorities on cannabis and the founder of a company called GW Pharmaceutical. GW Pharmaceutical makes a whole cannabis plant extract medicine known as Sativex. Canada was the first country in the world to legally allow it as medicine to help in the treatment of pain and spasticity in MS patients, and they're doing a whole bunch more research and it's been approved for pain and cancer as well. So this is not some fly-by-night type of researcher. And what they did is they used DNA barcodes on the plants in order to try to differentiate them. They wanted to see if sativa and indica were in fact two different species. It ends up they're not. They are subtypes, subspecies. So basically there's one species of cannabis with varieties. And so that's why it's probably going to take a while to be embraced. And as it says up there, the most likely explanation is that Richard Evan Schultes, who is a world-renowned botanist, he's a hero in most circles of people who study plant medicine, but it ends up that he most likely misidentified a cannabis plant. He didn't have the advantage of technology that we have now. The cannabis plant is considered by many the most versatile plant on the planet, and obviously the documentary following this is probably going to get into a lot of that a little bit more. But I can mention that there are literally tens of thousands of uses for the plant. Throughout the thousands of years of its known use, it's been used for religious and spiritual purposes, recreation and medicinal purposes, and I have intentionally actually put recreation and medicinal together. Despite the fact that most of the medical community and society at large thinks that the two are separate, if we adopt the position that many Aboriginal cultures have adopted, and always did, that medicine is anything that is good, that is health promoting, that promotes well-being, should be considered medicine. So whether it's good relationships, sleeping well, exercising, those things are preventive medicine and they have physiological effects. They are true medicine. And when you look at the statistics, most people who use cannabis recreationally do not abuse cannabis. They're only using periodically, and the majority of people are using for one reason: to chill out, to relax. This is actually a very healthy thing to do. And indeed, the research is also very clear that the way most recreational users use cannabis, sporadically, not heavily, that there are absolutely no long-term negative health consequences to that kind of use. Obviously, there's a multitude of industrial and textile uses for the plant. And nourishment. The hemp seed is one of the most complete forms of nutrition on the planet. And interestingly enough, in particular when Henry Ford was first making his cars and getting his empire set up, he was actually quite dedicated to using plant materials for all sorts of purposes. And he had a group of researchers who were dedicated to figuring this kind of stuff out. And they had a motto that anything that can be made from a hydrocarbon can be made from a carbohydrate. So anything that can be made from a fossil fuel, from oil, gas, can be made from a plant. And as we're going to discover, cannabis is one of the best plants to grow to make all of these kinds of things. This is just a brief little graphic of some of the multitudes of uses that cannabis can be used for. In essence, anything other than glass or metal can be made with cannabis or cannabis along with other plant materials. So even including things like plastics, explosives, and even concrete. It's called hempcrete. Take the inner herd of the hemp stalk, you encase it in limestone and water, and it hardens into stone, and you can build buildings with this. And not only is this material a carbon, it's not even a carbon neutral building material, it's actually a carbon negative building material. Because as plants grow, they sequester CO2, they die, the CO2 gets re-released into the atmosphere. These hemp plants are encased in stone. Their CO2 is trapped forever. So it's literally a carbon negative building material. The first definitive evidence that we have that cannabis was purposely cultivated comes from Taiwan in about 10,000 years before the Common Era, and they were cultivating hemp for fibre, particularly for things like rope. However, there is circumstantial evidence from the Czech Republic that cannabis may have been grown purposely for fibre approximately 23,000 years before the Common Era, which is a substantial jump. But like I said, it's circumstantial at this point. Around 4,000 years before the Common Era, there's evidence that the Chinese were using cannabis for textiles, so for making clothes. And very interestingly enough, that was weird. Ma is the Chinese character for hemp, and this is what it looks like, and it is literally two plants hanging or drying in a shed. There's also a second word for cannabis in Chinese, and it is da. So it is this symbol preceded by another symbol, which is pronounced da, I think. I can't speak Chinese. And da denotes large, great, or huge. So you either have just pure hemp cannabis or great hemp, large, great hemp cannabis. And cannabis was so well known and used within the culture that this character ma, hemp, actually is used in many compound words to denote many various things. So for instance, ma plus rice equals gruel or porridge. And the Chinese word for anesthesia is literally cannabis intoxication. So if the plant has been around for so long, a lot of people wonder, well, what evidence do we have for its medicinal use before recorded history? And when I talk about recorded history, I'm not talking about oral traditions or pictographs. I'm talking about the true written word, written language. And it ends up that, almost certainly yes, most experts agree that folks were using cannabis as medicine before recorded time. And this is because all ancient texts use the past tense when they're talking about cannabis. And some of these ancient texts go back to roughly 5,000 years ago, to the beginning of recorded history. In addition, no text mentions cannabis as being a recent discovery of the plant itself or its properties. This is from China. His name was Shen, the Emperor Shen. He is famous for having written in what we call in English the Great Herbal. Or in Chinese, the Pensao, amongst many other names. And he's considered the father of Chinese medicine, and this herbal book is actually still in use to this day. And he said, legend has it that he wrote this herbal around 2,700 years before the Common Era. The problem with this is that there are no currently existing pre-year 50 Common Era manuscripts, so we don't really know whenabouts it was written. And as you can imagine, the further back you go in history, the more mystical things can get, and they're quite difficult to establish. But he said of cannabis, that cannabis is the liberator of sin, it's good for female weakness, whatever that is, gout, rheumatism, malaria, beriberi, constipation, and absent-mindedness. And a lot of people laugh at the absent-mindedness part because most people are aware that cannabis intoxication with THC impairs your short-term memory. However, as we get further along and talk about some of the other compounds in the plant, they may not have actually been mistaken about that aspect. don't know what went on there. So now we get to India, and India is actually the first cannabis-oriented culture. Most people have heard of Shiva, of Hindu mythology. A lot of people don't know that amongst many other titles that Shiva holds is the Lord of Bhai, literally the god of cannabis. And this here is a picture denoting Ganesh, which is the orange elephant type little dude in the corner there. And he is making a cannabis-infused drink called bhang. And the woman up in the other part there is the goddess Parvati, and she is serving this cannabis-infused drink bhang to Lord Shiva. And interestingly enough, Shiva, the god of cannabis, is the single longest continuously worshipped god on the planet. So think about the implications of that. And it ends up that despite the fact that cannabis does originate in India, the most recent text we have of its use is roughly from 2000 to 1400 years before the Common Era, where they talk about the use of cannabis for anxiety, grief, and call it the bringer of joy. And largely was consumed in this drink I mentioned, which is made up of the leaves, flowering tops, ghee, which is clarified butter, milk, and spices. But they also use a lot of ganja, or dried resin, as we know today, hashish. When we get to Egypt, we actually find some of the best preserved documents of cannabis's use. For instance, from the Ramesses III papyrus, roughly 1700 years before the Common Era, there's a recipe for an ointment to treat an eye problem. A couple hundred years later, the Ebers papyrus from about 1500 years before the Common Era, and this is what it looks like. It's the oldest complete medical text in existence that we know of anyways, and there's some recipes for vaginal problem and fingernail problems. Another papyrus, the Berlin papyrus, has a recipe for treating fever. And there are others as well. And altogether, they held recipes for things like applying cannabis directly, largely for conditions that are inflammation related. And there are both rectal and vaginal suppositories that they have for. Sorry about that. And when we get to Mesopotamia or Assyria, this is actually where recorded history starts. Roughly 3,000, 3,100, 3,200 years before the Common Era, these folks invented cuneiform writing, which is writing on these clay tablets. Unfortunately, there are about 19,000 fragments of these clay tablets that were discovered in the ruins of a library that a king who ruled from 668 to 626 before the Common Era. And many of them were devoted to medical plants and potions. And a guy named Thompson spent 50 years of his life translating these medical texts, and he discovered that they actually had many words for cannabis. One being azalu, who knows if I'm saying it properly. Another one called ganzagunu, which literally translates as the weaving narcotic. A second translation for ganzagunu is also the drug that takes the mind away, because the weaving is actually spinning, and narcotic can also imply your spirit or soul. So it can be the weaving narcotic, which incorporates two aspects of the plant, or the drug that takes away the mind. Now, cannabis spread through the ancient world, obviously, and a group of people who are largely responsible for this are the Scythians. And they were an Iranian people of origin, and they were a fierce, nomadic people. They were quite brutal, but they were one of the first masters of the horse, and they loved their cannabis. Because they were one of the first masters of the horse, they traveled a lot, and they took cannabis with them wherever they went. So, for instance, they're largely responsible for introducing it to the Greeks and the Romans and others. I don't know why this one keeps skipping ahead. Anyways, Herodotus, who's considered the first Western historian, writing about 450 years before the Common Era, he writes about the Greeks using cannabis seeds, which were likely psychoactive because the cannabis seed actually grows within a little pod that actually has some of these trichomes on it. So they would throw these seeds onto basically a bronze urn that had coals in it, and they created a little tent where they would crawl in and put their heads under and inhale the fumes, and Herodotus talked about them howling with laughter. And it was, in this context, used within a funeral rite. But there's evidence that they also used it for other spiritual purposes, divination, etc. Over time, cannabis is mentioned more and more in either medical books, herbal books, or just historical documents. And of course, cannabis eventually made its way to Europe. And there's actually evidence that cannabis was known about and used in the Middle Ages, even in England. However, it's very likely that the plants that they were using were much less potent. And it's, as far as we know, from all the documents that we can read today, that it was not as well known or used as it was in the countries like India in the past. It wasn't until 1839 that cannabis had an explosion of awareness and use in the Western world, when William O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician who was stationed in India, brought it back to England. Now, when the European colonists were over in India, they were initially quite alarmed because cannabis in India, cannabis-oriented culture, was widespread, and they were very concerned that people were going insane and making themselves sick with it. But they also recognized that it was being used to a large degree by everybody to treat medical conditions. So he took it upon himself to find out what that was all about. Discovered that it actually worked, and brought it back to England, where famously, Queen Victoria is alleged to have used a tincture of cannabis or cannabis in an alcohol solution to treat her premenstrual cramps. You may not, or maybe you are aware, that cannabis was actually a foundational plant for the establishment of the United States. The first colonists that came over were mandated to grow hemp. They paid taxes in hemp. If they didn't grow hemp, they were punished. But it was primarily grown for fiber purposes, rope, sails, and clothing. Now, some people, especially some people who might be a little bit too pro-cannabis, mention that George Washington writes in his diary at one point that he was a little bit too late in separating the male plants from the female plants. So a lot of people have latched onto this and said, aha, they must have known about the drug purposes. George Washington and his buddies, they must have smoked pot. Well, it ends up that this is actually most likely untrue. If you go a few more days in his diary, he actually talks about retting, so putting the cannabis plants in water and this is what you do to separate the fiber within the herd from other parts of the plant. And it may have been that he was separating the males from the females for fiber production versus seed production. It doesn't definitively exclude that he may have been aware of its drug purposes, but I think the evidence leans more heavily in the other direction. But by 1843, at least one US medical text included cannabis as a treatment for a variety of conditions. So everything from gout, tetanus, hysteria, depression, insanity. And by 1851, cannabis is official. It is included in the third edition of the 1851 Pharmacopoeia of the United States of America. There we go. So third edition of the Pharmacopoeia of the United States of America. And it stays there until 1942. So it was part of the Pharmacopoeia for nearly 100 years, part of what some people call the golden era of cannabis medicine. Funnily enough, despite the fact that it was part of the Pharmacopoeia until 1942, the plant itself was made illegal in 1937. It took a few years for it to work its way out. And there are a variety of reasons for this that I'll talk about in a couple of moments. During this time, it was the first line of defense for over 100 medical conditions. Sorry, folks. There we go. Over 100 medical conditions, there were 2,000 meds that included cannabis as one of its primary ingredients before 1937, and over 280 manufacturers were involved. And this here is going to be some examples of some of these medicines. These three pictures are of a fluid extract, but it's interesting to note that they also produced joints that were prescribed and used to treat asthma. And people often go, what? And that's because the active compounds in the plant are an active bronchial dilator. So at the time, and people actually still can use cannabis to treat their asthma, but it's better to vaporize it than to smoke it, obviously. But it's just interesting to note that they were aware of this and using it back then. And some of the companies that were involved in the manufacturing of cannabis medicines were Eli Lilly, Park Davis and Company, ER Squibbs and Sons, and many others. Sheila, I got it now. You're doing okay. Keep going. So liquid extracts begin to fall out of favor. There's a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is the variable potency. So it was difficult to standardize the product. And this is due to things like seed type. So initially, they were growing in the US from domestic seeds rather than imported seeds. In addition, there was a lack of knowledge about how to grow it properly, not to mention the different weather conditions in portions of the United States versus places like Afghanistan and India. In addition, erratic absorption. So it's difficult to titrate dosage. And poor storage stability. So heat and sunlight break the active components down, and we're talking about an era where refrigeration wasn't available. So it was very difficult to mass produce these and send them out and expect to have any kind of standardized medicine. In addition, new and inexpensive drugs like aspirin came on the market and were marketed heavily. And of course, who can forget reefer madness and the legality aspect? So this is a topic in and of itself for a whole other day, but suffice it to say that the plant being made illegal had a major impact on its recognition as a medicine, its acceptance as a medicine, and the ability for anyone to use it, let alone do research on it. So we're going to fast forward quite a bit, and I'm going to jump to current times. So back in the 1990s is when the major resurgence of medical cannabis emerged, and this is largely as a result of cancer and AIDS patients who insisted that cannabis was helping them. Everyone else was telling them that they were crazy. The medical community was telling them that they were lying, that it was all in their head. The general population just laughed at them. And they were willing to risk their lives because they were insisting it was helping them, and they were jailed, arrested, and many people actually died as a result of their use of cannabis because they were deprived of the right to use cannabis. And this, of course, led to the first compassion clubs. These are acts of civil disobedience. They're all against the law. And it's people like Jim who take it upon themselves to put their entire beings at risk. You risk jail, you risk losing everything in order to provide people access to a medicine that is safer and that helps people, and it eliminates having to go directly to the black market, which eliminates other hard drugs being pushed on you, as well as the dangerous elements who are out there pushing those drugs. This also led to research. After a while, after many years of cancer and AIDS patients continuing to use cannabis despite their doctors telling them not to, etc. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush. It's not like all doctors were against just the larger community of the medical establishment. So they were forced to actually start doing some research, which established that yes, indeed, cannabis helps cancer and AIDS patients. And by 1996, California was the first state to legalize cannabis for medical uses. And even in 1996, this was met with ridicule, both from the larger general population and from the medical establishment at large. If we jump ahead, not even 20 years, to 2015, where are we at? The current state of affairs, we have 23 states, plus the District of Columbia, that have legislation allowing for medical use. Many others are pending. We have 4 states plus the District of Columbia that have complete legal use of cannabis, with 7 pending. And we have a few countries, Canada and the Netherlands for instance, that have national medical cannabis programs. So rather than going state by state or province by province, some countries have a complete national medical cannabis program. Uruguay in December 2013 became the first country in the world to legalize cannabis nationally for all uses. We're still waiting for that to roll out though. And several countries, because of these 4 states and Uruguay legalizing, it has prompted a global discussion on drug policy reform. And several countries are now considering legalizing with Canada included in there. And this has led to, so I talked about the medical establishment ridiculing it, the use of cannabis and the legalization for medical purposes back in 1996. Well, if you take a look at the medical establishment endorsements back then versus now, you'll find that the list is, orders of magnitude larger, because as the research has progressed, more and more healthcare professionals and medical established communities are endorsing its use. And this is because the list of medical conditions that are indicated for the use of cannabis continues to grow with more research, rather than the reverse, which is what most medical establishment doctors, etc., were saying at the time, that the more research we do, we're going to find out that it causes insanity, etc. And it ends up that this is not the case. In fact, this is a partial list of the medical conditions that can be affected positively by cannabis in some way, shape, or form. Most often, it's used for treatment of symptoms or management of symptoms to enhance your quality of life while going through severe medical conditions. Some of these medical conditions that are helped by cannabis are well established in the literature. Some have, strong support, some have a little weaker support, and some is only preliminary. But this is largely a result of the policies around cannabis that have in fact made it nearly impossible to do proper research around the medical aspects of whole plant cannabis until quite recently. And as I said, as the research continues, so do the medical conditions that cannabis can help. So how is it that one plant can help so many medical conditions? Because it seems kind of crazy. Back in the day, a lot of people would, they were of the opinion that, oh, you're just a pot smoking hippie, you're making it up, you smoke pot because you have a hangnail, it's just all in your head. Well, it ends up, it's actually not true. There is a legitimate scientific reason, and the reason is the endocannabinoid system. Most people have not heard of this word, and they're like, what? The what? The endocannabinoid system. So, by a show of hands, how many people here have heard of this word before? Okay, good, fair number of you. How about back in 2010, 5 years ago, how many people had heard of this word? Yeah, only a couple. Back in 2005, 10 years ago, how many people had heard of this word? Even fewer. So, if you do a search for endocannabinoid in PubMed and restrict your search terms to the year 1992, you'll find that there are only 2 publications. As of April 2015, there are nearly 7,000. And that's only looking for endocannabinoid. This does not include Endocannabinoid System, doesn't include cannabis and all of the other related words. So most people are like, what in the heck is an endocannabinoid? I'm going to relate it back to something that most people have at least heard of and are aware of, and these are endorphins. Endorphins are naturally occurring pain-killing molecules. And the word endorphin itself is a compound word of endogenous morphine. And the reason why it's morphine is that the plant products were discovered before the internal system that those plant products plug into to give us the desired effects, like pain relief. And these compounds are similar, obviously, the ones that we produce naturally, are similar in structure and effects to the ones that are produced by the plant. So we discovered opium first, and then we created heroin and morphine. And these compounds, they plug into a system of receptors. So you think of the compounds themselves as keys and the receptors as locks. The keys unlock the locks. Endocannabinoids are in essence the exact same thing. They are internally occurring neuromodulators. And this basically is a fancy word to say that your nerve cells, which are basically everything that helps your brain and your body communicate, can be affected, modulated by these compounds. And endogenous cannabinoids is the longer version of endocannabinoids, internally occurring. And of course, they are similar in structure and effects to cannabinoids themselves. And they also plug into a system of receptors. But I haven't defined what a cannabinoid is, so a lot of people are probably like, what is a cannabinoid? Cannabinoid is an umbrella term that is used to describe many of the main chemical components in the cannabis plant. THC is the most well-known and studied. It was discovered in 1964 by Raphael Mechoulam from Israel, and since that time, we have identified approximately 100 others. And these compounds are produced in what are called the trichomes. So this is a picture of flower, slang bud, and the compounds that we're interested in are not actually in the green part of the plant, they're in the little resin glands, the little trichomes there. And that's where all the magic happens. Hundreds and hundreds of chemical molecules are created in those little resin glands. Things start to get complicated though. In 1981, the first lab-produced THC is approved for use in Canada, actually. And then in 1988, the first cannabinoid receptor is found. So Mechoulam discovered THC in 1964. It took 24 more years to discover the first receptor that they plug into. So again, the compounds were named for the plant because we found those first. But we obviously knew that in order to affect human beings, that we must have an internally occurring system that they latch onto. But it took a long time to discover where and what they were. And then it wasn't until 1992 that the first endocannabinoid was discovered. So the first internally produced compound, like the compounds in the plant. And this was Raphael Mechoulam and his team again. And they nicknamed this compound anandamide. And ananda is Sanskrit for bliss, joy, or delight. Now, most people, just a few short years ago, if you're talking about cannabinoids, would say that the cannabinoids are unique to the cannabis plant. No other plant that we know of makes these compounds. But now we know that this is actually not true. In 2006, the first non-cannabis plant cannabinoids were discovered. So, because of these complications, we now have three terms for cannabinoids. Number one, there are phytocannabinoids, meaning they come from plants. Cannabis is the most well-known, produces the most cannabinoids and the most potent cannabinoids. But echinacea and liverwort also produce cannabinoids, as do some other plants. Second of all, we have the naturally occurring cannabinoids, the endocannabinoids. And third, anandamide is the first and the most well-known, but there's also 2-HE and some others that are being studied. Three, synthetic cannabinoids. These are obviously the ones that are made in a lab, and there are many, many of these, and a lot of them are actually many times more potent than the compounds that are produced in the plant. And this is both a good and a bad thing. Good for research purposes, because we can find how they actually work, but some of them bind so strongly that they actually have really negative consequences to health for people. So you may have heard of K2 or Spice, which they're often sold in head shops. I don't know if they're against the law some places. I don't know what the current status is here, but at least for a while these things were available. And these are basically plant material that are coated with some of these research cannabinoid molecules. And they're nasty. Nobody really knows what they're getting. Some people die. Many people have been permanently maimed and injured from them. Not saying that this happens to everybody, but the warning is, and the irony of it, is that the ones that are produced in the lab to find out how things actually work are dangerous, while the ones that are produced in the plant are not nearly as much. So it ends up that there are two main cannabinoid receptors. We talked about the first one, CB1, but there's also CB2. And these receptors are literally present pretty much in every tissue of your body. They are present in your brain, your lungs, your muscles, your blood vessels, your skin, your reproductive organs, your spleen, your gut, basically everywhere. Of pretty great importance is at the bottom in the blue with the side profile of the brain, you see that CB1 and CB2 receptors are present in the brain stem. Now, you may have heard that you can't die from an overdose from cannabis. And in fact, this is true, and it's because that despite the fact that we do have receptors in the brainstem, which is responsible for heart and respiration, the receptors are not present in the brainstem part that is responsible for respiration. So in essence, most drugs kill you by overwhelming those receptors and shutting down your breathing and your heart, and you die. And this does not happen with cannabinoids. Now, those two are the main receptors, but there are some others, and one of the other fairly well-known ones is TRPV1. And although it has a weird acronym, you're familiar with it because it is the site of action that the active component in chili peppers, capsaicin, latches onto. So when you're eating spicy food and getting the sweat on, you're actually activating your endocannabinoid system. 3 other receptors are likely, GPR18, GPR55, and GPR119. Now, the side profile of the brain there showed that these receptors are very prevalent in your brain. And in fact, CB1 receptors are the most abundant G protein coupled receptors in the mammal brain. And people are probably like, well, what does that mean? It doesn't really matter. It's just there to show you as a hint of how important these receptors must be. So it ends up that the endocannabinoid system is comprised of 3 main components. 1, the cannabinoids, the keys. 2, the receptors, the locks. And 3, enzymes that are used to break down the compounds that are floating around. They have to dissipate somehow, and they're broken down by enzymes. Now, remember when we talked about cannabis, it's been evolving for about 34 million years. The endocannabinoid system in animals has been evolving for about 600 million years. So we have a substantial difference in time. And it ends up that the simplest forms of life that have a nervous system, like hydra and sea slugs, have a primitive form of this endocannabinoid system. And it appears that, in fact, all animals, other than insects, have an endocannabinoid system of some kind. So, why would this be? What is the purpose of the endocannabinoid system? Because clearly, it must be important. It ends up that the endocannabinoid system is responsible for the homeostasis of your body. And homeostasis is basically just trying to maintain internal stability while adapting to conditions optimal for survival. So if you maintain successfully homeostasis, you will have life, and hopefully relatively disease-free life. However, failure to maintain homeostasis results in either death or illness. And this is an example of how this works. So it's like your thermostat at home, especially if you have an automatically set thermostat that can measure the temperature itself and turn itself on and off. If you set it at room temperature, say 20 degrees, and it's summertime out, your house might get a little bit too hot. Boom, air conditioner kicks in, brings it back down to 20 degrees. Conversely, if you've set it at 20 but it's wintertime out and it's quite cold, it cools down a little bit, the thermostat detects it, boom, the heat turns on, heats it back up to room temperature, to the set point. This is what the endocannabinoid system does for pretty much every physiological function in our bodies. So it ends up that the endocannabinoid system is, in fact, one of the most important medical discoveries ever, because, like I said, it affects nearly every physiological process. And in fact, Professor DiMarzo in 1998 said of the endocannabinoid system's purpose, it is to help us relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect. Sounds pretty important to me, and in fact, it is essential to life. Despite this fact, my own research, along with a more recent one from 2014, shows that there is a severe lack of knowledge amongst physicians about the endocannabinoid system. And for some who know a little bit of it, they're reluctant to accept it for some reason. So how does the endocannabinoid system work? I know that's a lot of stuff out there, so just bear with me. I will explain it step by step. A presynaptic neuron is basically just a nerve cell that comes before the gap. So that white gap in there is called the synaptic cleft. And the postsynaptic neuron is a nerve cell that comes after the gap. If you look at the four large circles, think of those as vehicles, as cars, and the four little circles within them as passengers. And their passengers are neurotransmitters. They are chemical messengers. They communicate to one another with these chemicals. So what happens is the neurotransmitters are released from these vesicles and they float across the gap and they latch onto a receptor on the other side to unlock it and activate it. And when they do so, they actually, on demand, the postsynaptic neuron, so the nerve cell after the gap, produces on demand endocannabinoids like anandamide or 2-AG. And then they diffuse backwards up towards the receptor on the neuron that came before it. And they plug into that, it's called retrograde signaling, they plug into that receptor, next one. They plug into the receptor and a whole, click again. Plug into the receptor and a whole cascade of events happens. It activates that G protein that it was coupled to, which results in the inhibition of the release of the neurotransmitter that was initially released. And why this is important to us is that, and why this is important to us is that both phytocannabinoids and synthetic cannabinoids circumvent, they get around this multi-stage process by being directly introduced to the body and then directly latching onto the receptors, activating the endocannabinoid system and either mimicking or enhancing its function. Now, the inhibition of a neurotransmitter does not necessarily mean that the result is going to be an inhibition of response, because it depends on the neurotransmitter that is inhibited. So it can lead to more or less activation. Keep going. So there are a couple of neurotransmitters you may have heard of: dopamine, GABA, glutamate. And I'm going to relate how glutamate works with nerve pain and cannabinoids. So glutamate is a stimulatory neurotransmitter. It activates things, it gets things going. But too much of it leads to nerve pain, and in the case of traumatic brain injury, it leads to nerve death, nerve cell death. And that is not a good thing at all. The body's response to these kinds of insults is to produce the endocannabinoids. And the reason they do it is to inhibit the release of glutamate. Once that has occurred, you get pain relief, and in the case of traumatic brain injury and cell death, you get less cell death. This is very important because THC and cannabidiol have similar effects. And in fact, there is mounting evidence that cannabinoids should be used as an intervention for traumatic brain injury. The sooner you can introduce cannabinoids to an injured brain, whether it's from stroke, blunt force trauma, etc., the better recovery and the less brain damage occurs. And in fact, I estimate that in the next few years, many professional sports teams, in particular the NFL right now, will likely allow cannabis to be used for pain primarily, but also the big thing right now is the accumulation of concussions and brain injury. So my estimation is that in the next little while, many of the major sports teams are going to allow cannabis because A, it's safer than the opiates that they're all using, and it's preventative and protective. So some other important phytocannabinoids, it's a good time to talk about them. We've all known and heard about THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. Some of its main medical uses are that it's anti-cancer, provides pain relief, helps people sleep, some mood elevation. Obviously, people use it to eat if they are sick with cancer or AIDS. It also helps with nausea and vomiting. However, there are some negative aspects to it as well. Negative depends on who you are and how you're perceiving it. Most people consider cognitive impairment and an effect on your short-term memory to be negative. And it indeed has this effect, there's no denying that. In addition, for some folks, even some healthy folks, too much THC can induce anxiety or panic. For folks who suffer from anxiety, this can be a pretty tricky situation to be in if you're using THC alone. It ends up that THC has a fairly narrow therapeutic window. Too little doesn't really do much. Too much causes panic and anxiety, so there's like this, the sweet spot. But we're going to talk about other compounds that combat that. In addition, a big thing is if you consume a lot of THC, like say you ingested far too many pot brownies, you may enter a dissociative state. And this is no laughing matter, because it is, for folks who experience it, it can be terrifying. And it can also lead people to engage in really crazy behaviors that are often dangerous as well. The second most abundant compound in the plant is called cannabidiol, or CBD for short. And we're going to have a slide coming up, and we're going to talk about the effects of some of these. Another important phytocannabinoid is cannabichromine, or CBC. Another one is cannabigerol, or CBG. Importantly, in the last few years, there's also been a lot of attention paid to the acidic forms of these compounds. So when we talk about THC, we're actually talking about a compound that doesn't actually really exist in the plant itself. When the plant is growing and alive, it's actually in an acid form. So basically it's THC acid. And this is non-psychoactive. And it ends up that it also is likely very medicinally useful. It's not until the plants are cured, dried, and then either smoked, vaporized, or ingested through brownies that it turns into THC through heat activating, changing the molecule. This is a slide showing many of the therapeutic aspects of some of the non-psychoactive compounds in the plant. Up top there is CBD and blue. This is probably by far the most medically therapeutic compound in the plant. And this is not to say, there's some people who are pushing for, we should do away with THC altogether because it has some of these potentially negative consequences. But the reality is that a lot of people derive a lot of benefit from THC. So, and all of the molecules working together are better than apart. However, it is true that CBD seems to be, by a huge therapeutic compound. We're talking anti-anxiety, anti-cancer, antioxidant, antispasmodic, anti-epilepsy, and on and on. Interestingly enough, I was just talking about molecules working together. There are some other compounds in the plant called terpenes, and these are the molecules that lend the various odors to the plant. They are safe for human consumption. They have their own therapeutic uses, and they form what's called, what's often termed the entourage effect. So in essence, these compounds work in conjunction with compounds like THC, and they enhance one another. So for instance, some of these compounds, for instance, limonene at the Vernacular that's found in citrus, it's been used in conjunction with THC for pain relief. And what they found is that they get half the dose of THC and get the same amount of pain relief if they included this terpene. And this is important for a lot of folks because, not everybody wants to get high. Not everybody wants to have that cognitive fuzzy feeling in the head, and they would prefer to get whatever medical aspect they need without their cognition affected by it. And as you can see, the reason why these compounds are safe that we know is that they are present in the plant kingdom all over the place. They are the same compounds that give the aroma to pine needles, citrus, flowers, and so they're pervasive. And I'm going to point out beta-caryophyllene right here, because it ends up that not only is beta-caryophyllene a terpene, it's also actually a cannabinoid. In 2008, it was found that it is a selective agonist, meaning that it binds only to one receptor, the CB2 receptor, and activates it. And this means that you can get the medical effects without the high. CB1 receptor is the receptor that THC binds to and causes the highness, cognitive impairment, etc. Researchers have been trying for a long time to create a compound, a cannabinoid, that would only target the CB2 receptor. Ta-da! And it's probably better than synthetic ones. And research shows that beta-caryophyllene in and of itself has some pretty powerful antidepressant, anti-anxiety, anti-inflammation properties, as well as being a neuroprotectant. And beta-caryophyllene is present in a whole bunch of other plants other than black pepper or cannabis that we know of. Cloves, rosemary, hops again, and there are many others that also contain. And in fact, beta-caryophyllene is an FDA-approved food additive, which means, ironically enough, that beta-caryophyllene is the first dietary cannabinoid. Now, because these receptors and compounds are pretty much everywhere in your body, some people start to wonder, well, I know like the theory that depression may be caused by, a chemical malfunction in the brain, I don't have enough serotonin or whatever. Maybe it's true that I have a dysfunctional endocannabinoid system. Might that not result in disease? And it ends up that, yes. In 2004, Ethan Russo, who is also one of the world's authorities on cannabis, he wrote a paper where he proposed that a lot of very difficult to treat conditions like irritable bowel syndrome, migraine, were a result of a deficient endocannabinoid system. In 2014, a couple of researchers decided, hey, it's been 10, 11 years, let's see what the literature says now. And if you read the bottom here, they've discovered the same thing, that yes, indeed, the deficient endocannabinoid system is likely the root cause for many medical conditions that are difficult to treat, including migraine, fibromyalgia, and irritable bowel syndrome. But not only those three, there's mounting evidence that there's a whole host of medical conditions that at the root cause is a deficient or dysfunctional endocannabinoid system. Now I want to briefly talk about some memes and myths that are out there. So some things you may have heard about cannabis that you're kind of unsure of, or things that you may have accepted as truth that are not. One of these is that cannabis cures cancer, or cannabis oil, cannabinoids cure cancer. Now if you take a look on the internet, you're going to come across things like this all over the place. And this is actually very true. I'm not denying this. What I want to point out is that when a claim is made that cannabis cures cancer, you're talking about all forms of cancer for everyone. This is what we know so far. We know from hundreds of research studies, but these are mostly on animal models, that the cannabinoids stop cancer cells from dividing. They prevent new blood vessels from forming to feed tumors. They prevent metastasis or the spreading of cancer cells to other parts of the body. Pretty important. They also speed up autophagy, which is basically getting rid of the waste products from the cells. And speeding this process up can actually lead to cell death, which is a good thing in the case of a cancer cell. And probably most importantly, cannabinoids trigger cell death, or apoptosis. Cancer cells kill us because that mechanism has been turned off. They forget to kill themselves, and they continue to replicate and grow and eventually take over your organs and kill you. Cannabinoids, some of the cannabinoids at least, can turn that mechanism back on. The abnormal transformed cancer cells die, slough off, and are replaced by healthy cells. And it ends up that, since the plant's been around for so long and we're discovering all these anti-cancer properties, did anyone in the past know about this? It ends up that they may actually have. It's possible that in Egypt, possibly around 600 years before the Common Era, that they knew about this. The translations, they obviously didn't have the technology knowledge we have. They called them tumors, but there are several kinds of tumors that can exist. So we don't know for sure whether they were using it to treat cancer per se, but certainly they did talk about tumors. The aspect I want to point out, despite all of the evidence I'm just talking about, I want to point out that I have a mole on the side of my head here that in the last little while turned black and scaly. These are two of the major signs of melanoma. I'm waiting to see a specialist in May. It's been a long wait, number of weeks. In the meantime, I've been putting cannabis oil on it. And after a couple of weeks of doing that, it's a completely changed mole. So I just want to point out that I'm well aware and I accept that cannabinoids help with cancer, despite what I'm going to point out now. Cancer is very complicated. There are a wide range of effects. So yes, there are amazing successes that most of us in here are well aware of, but there's also some pretty dramatic failures. I myself, I've personally witnessed people's moles, completely go away that were diagnosed cancer. But I've also known people who had various kinds of cancer who were using large amounts of oil who still died. And this is just the reality. In addition, some of the research is pointing out that under some conditions, some kinds of cancer can actually be encouraged with some of the cannabinoids. Some kinds of cancer can develop resistance to the cannabinoids. However, there is a workaround. You can block what's called the ALK pathway to get around this. And emerging research showing that chemo and radiation combined with cannabinoids are actually most likely better in combination than any of them on their own. Now I know that for some people here that's going to be controversial, but this is the state of affairs for research at the moment. And if you spend any time working with people in dispensaries, you will come across the fact that some people are using the cannabis oils in the same way as people who are cured and they still die. We don't really understand why, and this is largely a result of prohibitionist policies because it's 2015. The United States government has known about some of these anti-cancer effects since 1974, and the policies have made it such that research has been stymied still to this day to investigate these aspects. So it's unlikely that cannabinoids are going to be a magic bullet for cancer for everyone. This is not to deny the fact that some people are certainly going to be helped. And the research clearly shows that for some kinds of cancer, especially in animal models, that some of the tumors completely disappear, but some only shrink significantly, some less so, and some don't shrink very much at all. And that is not a good state of affairs if you're the person who actually has that cancer. A small shrinkage in the tumor is better than nothing, but you still have cancer. You may have also heard that cannabis or cannabinoids cures epilepsy or Dravet syndrome. And again, you have to keep in mind that when you make this claim or when this claim is made, it implies that everyone with any kind of epileptic condition will be cured. And again, epilepsy, seizure disorders are very complicated. And again, there are a wide range of effects. I guess first I should tell you what Dravet syndrome is. Dravet syndrome is a horrible condition that, in essence, the folks who have it do not have a very long life expectancy because they suffer up to several hundred seizures per day, any of which can lead to permanent brain damage and eventually to death. Currently, there are no known medical interventions that really help these poor folks. And so, of course, I think you would be foolish to not allow even a child to use these compounds because there have been amazing successes with some people with cannabidiol. Some children who have been suffering from hundreds of seizures a day they're not there, they're absent because their brain is in such chaotic condition all the time that they can't care for themselves, they don't talk, they don't make eye contact. And after introducing cannabidiol, even just over a very short period of time, some children have experienced a complete stoppage of their seizures. Most people don't get that though. Most people have a dramatic reduction, but not an elimination. And unfortunately, not every kid whose parents have moved them to Colorado, because in the States that's what they're doing, to get access to high cannabidiol strains, not all of them are helped. And the same is occurring here. Like I said, things are complicated. But because cannabidiol is non-psychoactive and has so many medical benefits, I believe that everyone should have access to it. And as I mentioned, there's been successes, but there's also some failure. And this is just the reality of the situation. We can't ignore the fact that some people are not helped and only focus on those people who are, because the story is more complicated than that. You may have also heard that cannabis smoking causes lung cancer. And this is also a complicated story. So it's difficult to separate cannabis-only smoking research out from cannabis plus tobacco, because most of this research is not people in a lab who are like, here, smoke a whole bunch of pot for 40 years and let's see what happens. They're general population. And unfortunately, much of the world, when they consume cannabis in smoke form, mix it with tobacco. Not like in BC. Most people in BC, when they're smoking cannabis, they're smoking just pure cannabis. But most of the rest of the world doesn't do that. Another thing to keep in mind are the amounts consumed. So a typical smoker smoking between a half pack to a full pack a day. That's 11 to 22 1-gram cigarettes per day. Very, very, very few people smoke that much cannabis. Most people consume 1 to 3 grams of cannabis, even most heavy medical cannabis users. This is not to deny that there are a small subpopulation of medical users who use a lot of cannabis. I personally have known a gentleman who was severely brain damaged, and part of his brain damage resulted in severe seizures and uncontrollable vomiting. So he smokes 21 1-gram joints every single day. Now, it does help him to a large degree, but it also impairs him. His short-term memory is totally shot. Tried getting him to use cannabidiol to help out, but he'd been smoking what he'd been smoking for a long time and was set with it. And that's fine. I mean, it helps him survive. The alternatives are that this guy would literally be dead. Another thing to keep in mind is the difference between nicotine and cannabinoids themselves, as well as both of their receptors. We just talked about the fact that cannabinoids have anti-cancer properties. Nicotine does not. And in fact, nicotine actually can help promote the transformation of cells to become abnormal. And then the receptors can actually promote them to hang out for longer. And the longer they hang out, the more likely they are to become more abnormal and transformed and eventually turn into cancer. Cannabinoids, on the other hand, can help turn on that process where abnormal cells go, hey, I shouldn't be hanging around because I'm an abnormal cell, and they die, slough off, and are replaced by healthy cells. In addition, Dr. Donald Tashkin, this is one of the world's leading authorities on pulmonary function and cannabis and cigarette smoking. He had 30 years of uninterrupted funding from NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Their mandate is to research only the harms associated with the use of drugs, not the benefits. 30 years of uninterrupted research from this guy. 2006, he and his team published a longitudinal large study which showed that even long-term heavy smoking defined as 1 joint per day, did not lead to an increased risk for lung cancer. In fact, there was a slight protective effect, probably because of the anti-cancer properties of the cannabinoids. But this is not to say that smoking is a good thing. If you smoke cannabis, especially if you smoke a lot, and especially if you smoke over a long period of time, you will experience lung dysfunction. You're going to cough, you're going to have phlegm and sputum, and these are not necessarily pleasant, and they're not necessarily a good thing for you or something you want to live with. Here's where it gets a little bit complicated as well. Because most research defines heavy use as 1 joint per day, we don't really know at the moment what this might mean for really heavy long-term users. So we're talking people who consume multiple joints per day over many decades. Some research shows that there may be an elevated risk for lung cancer. Some research shows that there's not. All we can say at this point is that we don't really know, but we've talked about a lot of the evidence showing that it's certainly not as harmful as tobacco, and that there are protective properties associated with the cannabinoids. And of course, the solution to smoking is don't smoke. You don't need to smoke. You can vaporize, which is getting the plant heated up to a point where the plant material doesn't burn, so it's not going to turn into smoke. The drug compounds in the little resin glands, they boil off. They turn into a vapor, and you can inhale that and get the medical benefit without inhaling smoke. And in fact, some research shows that 30 days of exclusive vaporizer use amongst people who were formerly cannabis smokers and fairly heavy cannabis smokers, they all had some lung dysfunction. 30 days of exclusive vaporizing led to lung improvement. So they basically got rid of a lot of the gunk out of their lungs, and their lung capacity and health improved. And of course, sorry, go back. Not everybody has access. I recognize, it sounds pretty glib, just don't smoke. It's more complicated than that. Some people prefer the feeling of smoking because it is a different chemical process. It does feel different than vaporizing, and not everybody appreciates the vaporizing. The other thing is that in order to vaporize, you have to have some sort of instrument. You have to spend some money on an apparatus of some sort. Not everybody has the money for that. So, despite the fact that we're saying we should vaporize and stuff, I'm not one to say that smoking should be completely eliminated because A, most people, even most medical consumers, don't consume enough cannabis in smoke form to really be alarmed about it. Now, this is an example of an abstract from February 2015, where some folks did a pooled analysis of participants from a number of countries. So not just one country, we're talking multiple countries. And they looked at long-term cannabis smoking. And at the bottom, results from our pooled analyses provide little evidence of increased risk of lung cancer among habitual or long-term cannabis smokers. And then the caveat that it doesn't exclude the fact that there may be harm for those very heavy users. But it's just kind of showing you that despite many, many decades of effort from governments and research facilities all over the world trying to prove that cannabis smoking causes cancer, 40, 50 years later, we still have no causal proof that smoking cannabis causes cancer. Another thing you may have heard is that cannabis smoking or use causes schizophrenia or psychosis. Now, there's a couple elements of truth to this. One of the elements of truth is that high doses of THC for some folks can lead to psychosis, but it's temporary. Once the drug wears off, the people are fine. This is not to say that this is something that should be just sloughed off. Oh yeah, no big deal. Because if you've ever been present when someone has experienced a psychotic break because of their cannabis use, it's a pretty frightening experience, both for the person experiencing it and for the person who is trying to take care of them. Important to keep in mind is that schizophrenia occurs in roughly 1% of the population all over the planet. So it's not a very large, it doesn't affect that many people percentage-wise in the population. And in fact, although the 1% stat is the most widely accepted, recent research shows that, in fact, it's most likely quite a bit lower than that. Now, if you take a look at the trends in use of cannabis by country and by year and make comparisons between countries, what we find out is that it's almost certainly the case that cannabis does not cause schizophrenia. And how we know this is that cannabis was not widely used until the 1960s. So, if cannabis causes cancer, we should be able to track the huge explosion of cannabis use all over the Western world from the 1960s to now, and there should be a concurrent spike in the diagnoses of schizophrenia and psychosis. And there's not. Across time, across countries, it's roughly 1%. And so, for instance, if you compare a high cannabis-using country like Canada to a low cannabis-using country like Japan, over many decades, you will find that they have the same rates of schizophrenia and psychosis across time. The other element of truth to this is that it is almost certainly the case that it can lead to earlier onset of schizophrenia, but it's complicated. It's a very, very small subset of people with schizophrenia. There are folks who have early heavy use of cannabis, so we're talking heavy use before the ages of 14 and 15, and they must also have a specific gene mutation. So, less than 1% of the population has schizophrenia, even fewer are early heavy users and have a gene mutation. So, despite the fact that this is almost certainly the case, almost certainly true, it's not a valid reason to maintain the illegality of cannabis, and it is certainly not a valid reason to deny access to cannabis for the vast majority of the rest of us who don't have to worry about that. The other aspect that's important is THC versus CBD. So THC, I guess first I'll define positive and negative symptoms. So schizophrenia is comprised of what are called positive and negative symptoms. The positive symptoms are the auditory and visual hallucinations and delusions. The negative symptoms are things like inability to maintain coherent thoughts and have verbal fluency. Here's where it gets complicated. THC almost certainly negatively affects the hallucination. So if someone's becoming psychotic, experiencing hallucinations and delusions, if they consume high amounts of THC, it almost certainly makes those worse. But THC has a positive impact on the negative symptoms. And these symptoms are also very important because the inability to maintain coherent thoughts and maintain verbal fluency leads a lot of people with schizophrenia to isolate. And THC has a positive impact on that. There's also some research showing that cannabis smoking schizophrenics have better survival rates than non-cannabis smoking schizophrenics. I had that backwards. Keep going. And then, of course, there's the very, very important aspect that cannabidiol itself, if you remember when we looked at that pie chart with CBD in the blue, cannabidiol is an antipsychotic, and it's actually a powerful one. It has been isolated and used in clinical research in double-blind, placebo-controlled research. At least one study where some folks were given placebo, some were given a typically used antipsychotic medication, and others were given pure cannabidiol. Cannabidiol was able to control their hallucinations and delusions as well as the typically used antipsychotic medication, but without the negative consequences typically associated with antipsychotic medication use, like severe weight gain and tardive dyskinesia, which is involuntary muscle movements that are permanent as a result of many antipsychotic medications. And of course, this begs the question, how does this happen? Well, it's actually directly related to the prohibitionist policies. Because the growing of cannabis is illegal, the consuming of cannabis is illegal, the major driver of the market has been the recreational market, where people want to get as high as possible, which means they want plants that have the most amount of THC, which in turn leads to a dearth, so a lack of access to variety for people. So a lot of schizophrenics, from what I've just talked about, it appears that a lot of schizophrenics are likely self-medicating with cannabis. But most people, when they're buying from a dealer, they have no idea what they're getting, and most people, they have no idea about the compounds in the plant. If people had access to a wide variety, there would likely be a lot less negative consequences associated with cannabis use overall. And unfortunately, a lot of research, and especially the media, when they have their big headlines, they treat cannabis as one drug. They treat it as if cannabis is a term for one compound, when in fact there are hundreds. So it's different, to say that cannabis smoking causes schizophrenia is a vast oversimplification type of thing, because it's vastly more complicated than that. You may have also heard that smoking cannabis early and heavily leads to permanent and substantial decrease in IQ. The truth of the matter is we actually don't really know this yet. And it's also a very controversial topic because the history of IQ testing in and of itself is very controversial because it's tied to eugenics. There's also questions about the validity of IQ testing. Currently, right now, there are a lot of researchers who are proposing that the IQ test be completely done away with and that they revamp the whole thing, because there are clearly multiple kinds of intelligences, and the current tests are fundamentally flawed. And there's also this curious thing called the Flynn effect. And the Flynn effect, in essence, shows that since 1930, there has been around a 3-point increase in IQ testing every decade. So what this means is that, these tests are standardized. A score of 100 puts you in the middle of the bell curve. However, every few years, they have to re-standardize these tests. So a person who wrote the test in 1930 or 40 or 50 and scored 100, if they wrote a test that is on the market today, they would not score 100. They would score substantially lower. There are many explanations for why this might actually be occurring, but the main reason why I bring this up is just to show that, again, the story is much more complicated than we are led to believe. There are several critics. In addition, the main aspect of this lowering of IQ was related to really one main study. And some of the criticisms about this study have been that they didn't properly address socioeconomic status, so in particular poverty. We know that poverty and severe poverty has a negative impact on the development of the brain in young people. Not only that, but poverty means people have less access to enriched environments. A lack of access to enriched environments has a negative impact as well. Poverty, people who live in poverty are also more likely to experience other kinds of traumatic events that also have negative impacts on their development. And over time, if you start off as a smart kid and you live in poverty and have traumatic experiences, you don't get to be part of a dance group or take music lessons or part of a sports team, that's going to lead to a different outcome than those kids who, all things being equal, had access to those. Another criticism is that they hardly ever look at changes in IQ in children before their exposure to cannabis. So, for instance, in 9 and 11 year, if you track the change in IQ scores from kids when they're 9 to 11 versus after they get exposed to cannabis, were their changes the same pre-exposure to cannabis as after? We don't really know. And if the changes were the same prior to exposure to cannabis, then it's not cannabis. And the reason I point this out is that the media and the researchers themselves were postulating this as a causal study when in fact it was not. It was a correlational study. So some of the critics pointing out that there's clearly some methodological flaws with their study, and that it's likely they've overestimated their effects, and that it's premature to say that early heavy use leads to permanent lowering in IQ. There's also some studies showing that this is not the case. However, I do want to point out that it is entirely possible, and I would even say that it's likely true actually, because when just using common sense, if you're smoking a lot of cannabis and you're young and your brain is not fully developed, and cannabis, high THC, affects your short-term memory, that is clearly going to have an impact on your learning, which may have a long-term impact. And the other aspect that we know from animal model studies, at least, is that exposure to high amounts of THC when animals are young can inhibit the growth of parts of the brain, and in humans in particular, the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe, the frontal cortex, is responsible for impulse control and higher reasoning. So your ability to make smart choices for yourself. But again, complication. This may largely be tied to. I can just keep going. May largely be tied to THC versus CBD. Did the battery die?
I don't think so. I don't know what's going on.
Maybe tied to THC versus CBD as well. THC is the compound that affects cognitive impairment, but CBD, along with the anti-anxiety effects, etc., counters the cognitive impairment of THC. So it's not. I'm not advocating, hey, if you're a kid, go smoke a lot of pot. Just pointing out that the negative impacts associated with cannabis use, again, are probably likely directly related to prohibitionist policies as well. In addition, something important to point out is that people's physiology is different. So some kids with severe medical conditions, their use of cannabis, even high THC strains of cannabis, affects them differently, affects their brains differently than supposed healthy kids who would be consuming the same amount. Lastly, I would like to address the gateway theory. So I don't know why this is still out there, but it is. And a lot of people truly believe this, that cannabis is a gateway to heroin and cocaine, etc. And this is just complete hogwash. No drug in and of itself leads people to consume other drugs. These are tied to things like personality factors, like impulsivity and sensation seeking, not to the drugs in and of themselves. In addition, for instance, in 2002, the Canadian government actually did a pretty big study, and they addressed this very question. And what they said is, yes, cannabis is a gateway drug, but only in the sense that because of the illegal market, people are forced to go to drug dealers. And drug dealers have other drugs to push on you. And they may also be like, oh, I don't have cannabis today. Would you like to try some cocaine? So the black market itself is the gateway drug. Now, what I find funny as well is that everyone, when they're talking about the gateway drug, they always talk about cannabis. And they typically say it's because cannabis is the first illicit drug that teens use. There we go. Thank you. So, cannabis is the first illicit drug that teens use. But this is actually not true. Alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine are drugs as well. And if you are using alcohol, tobacco when you are underage, it is also against the law. So, if we are going to talk about drugs as gateway drugs, we need to include all drugs. And if we're going to talk about illegal drugs, then we need to include alcohol, tobacco being consumed underage. And clearly, this kind of basically proves the point that it's culture, what drugs are available, and the black market that are largely responsible for what drugs people use. And the argument itself is faulty logic to begin with. It may be true that most heroin addicts consumed cannabis in their past, that was their gateway drug. But if you look at the statistics globally of the vast hundreds of millions of people who consume cannabis, for most of the people in the world, everywhere, cannabis is what's called a terminus drug. It is the last drug they use. Most people all over the world consume alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, and eventually they get to cannabis, and that's the last drug they use. They stop. If it were true that cannabis was a gateway drug, there should be many, many orders of magnitude more heroin, cocaine addicts, crack addicts in the world than there currently are. In addition, cannabis is a legitimate drug that can be used to help fight addiction, and also as a hard drug substitute. My own research actually addressed this issue because we asked people why they were using, how much they used, and some of the questions we asked was, are you using cannabis as a substitute for alcohol, street drugs, and even prescription medications? And then we asked them why. And the typical response was that the side effects from cannabis were more manageable, and they got better relief from cannabis than they did from their pharmaceuticals. And as far as a substitute for street drugs, is that it helped them control their cravings. And this is actually well established in the scientific literature that people who are using opiates for pain relief and people who are addicted to opiates, if they introduce cannabinoids into their drug regimen, especially if they're doing it with the purpose to try to control their opiate use, it leads to a drastic reduction in opiate use. And this is very well established. And in fact, so well established that currently pharmaceutical companies are working on developing a drug to help combat drug addiction, including addiction to cannabis, based on cannabidiol, because of its profound effects on people's drug-seeking behavior and use. And that concludes the presentation. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I'm 60 and I'm just concerned about the future and homes for the elderly and how cannabis is going to be provided. I personally enjoy smoking the bud.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know how this generation is going to prepare for the inevitable.
Well, you are part of a generation that will change everything. You guys have the largest group of people. You have the most money, the most power, and because, interestingly enough, your demographic is actually the fastest growing demographic who are switching to using cannabis. So back in the day, a lot of you folks your age, smoked pot, partied, then you grew up, got jobs, got kids, pot is bad, I told your kids, pot is bad, it's dangerous, it's evil, it's crazy. You're a little bit older, you're starting to get some aches and pains and some, age-related diseases. Start going to, parties with some of your friends and, have a toke here or there. And funnily enough, you're at a party for fun and you go, my arthritis isn't acting up so much, my knees feel a little bit better. So people are discovering, again, baby boom generation is rediscovering cannabis not for fun, but to help them out. So right now, if you're living in, say, an assisted living or a long-term care facility, yeah, it's a really sticky situation. But things are changing, and they are very likely to change because of the force of the power that your generation holds. It'll take some time, but laws will change. I mean, currently, oh, thanks. Yeah, should have done that. Currently, there are some hospitals that allow vaporizing in hospital rooms, as long as it's vaporized and not smoked. Some where they don't at all, and it's actually a big problem. I imagine that over time they'll sort these things out. It's not very helpful for people right now who are suffering. So, for instance, right now in Calgary, there's a woman who basically, according to her specialists and her family physicians, cannabis, and for her in particular, vaporized, is the only form that she can take. She's had lots of her intestines removed, she can't eat it, she can't smoke it, and it's basically keeping her alive. But she is denied access to any medical facility at all in Alberta. It's a crazy, crazy story. She's been assaulted, she's got a whole bunch of court cases going on. They've said we're working on, you can consume it, but only in a negative pressure room where the vapor can't escape at all. But they're all right now under construction. We don't know when they're going to happen. So in essence, she's being completely denied service. And they say, well, we could provide you cannabis in another form. You could have a pill or whatever. And despite the fact that her family physician and multiple specialists have gone to bat for her, they are refusing. This will not be the case 10 years from now. My opinion is that forms of cannabis use will be incorporated. I don't think smoking will be allowed, but I think vaporizing will be allowed, especially if it's likely that they'll develop some kind of mechanism where you can blow the vapor out into like a carbon and HEPA filter that will actually trap all of the vapor to begin with. So you can get the benefits, and nobody else has to experience the vapor. Any other questions? Yes?
Can you tell me how long cannabis oil in Canada, how long before it's legal?
How long, pardon?
Cannabis oil.
How long cannabis oil what?
Production of cannabis oil in Canada for medicinal purposes.
Like how long cannabis oil has been produced in Canada?
No, how long will it take for it's legal
Oh.
to be produced
For it to be legal? That is I don't think anybody really knows.
We have no idea?
Well, it's complicated. I think things are moving very fast, but if you look historically at all the predictions before, in the 70s, that everybody was like, there's no way they're going to keep cannabis illegal. Look at all the evidence. It's highly beneficial. It's going to be legal in the next few years.
We're talking about cannabis oil. It's medicinally proven to be effective in the States, in Colorado. They're using it.
Are you talking about active? Are you talking about active cannabis oil, like with THC and CBD in it? Or are you talking about?
No, medicinal only.
Well,
0.003% THC. How long before we can produce oil in Canada? They're
legally.
doing it in Colorado.
And that's.
Vernacular is buying everything they can produce.
I know. I think it's going to be a long time. Cannabidiol itself is still a controlled substance in Canada. If you grow hemp, which has 0.03% THC, you have to get inspected by Health Canada inspectors. You have to have 10 acres. Like, it's highly secure.
But
despite the fact
it's totally illegal in Canada to produce oil.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Even if you're a licensed medical user, the only legal form is the raw plant itself. There's an exception in BC. A guy from Vancouver Island who was making edibles for Compassion Club was arrested while he was making these edibles, and a court case happened where he was being charged with trafficking, and they had to have a trial within a trial, voir dire, where they were trying to establish whether or not concentrates were harm reducing or harm promoting. Because currently, if you are a licensed medical user and you want to make yourself a brownie, you can. But you are legally supposed to just grind the plant matter up and mix it in with your batter. Most people think that's gross, because it is. The most effective way to do it is to leach the compounds off into the butter and then cook with the butter. But that is technically against the law. However, BC Supreme Court ruling a couple years ago said, in fact, obviously, the evidence is very clear. It's actually a harm-reducing benefit to do that. The court case has gone all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada because the government said, we don't care about the evidence, we're going to fight this. That court case was just heard a few weeks ago, and they're going to decide on it. I think, things are moving very quickly, but if you, like I said, if you look at all the, I don't want to make a prediction because most predictions are proven wrong. There's no way to predict how fast things are going to change, but I think they are going to change fast.
That's what I'd like to hear.
Anyone else? Nope, all right.
Question.
Yes.
Yes. Are you aware of any insurance providers that will cover natural medicines like cannabis?
Like health insurance?
Yes.
Ooh. No. Other than Veterans Affairs,
Yes.
if you're a vet, and this is the irony of it all, right? That despite the fact that we have a medical cannabis program in place, the program was put in place because of court challenges, not because it's officially sanctioned or endorsed. So it's kind of like, yeah, you beat us at the law game, so here's your stupid program, you whining, crying babies. And every step of the way, the government has been, obstructing the program and making it so crazy problematic. Veterans, though, they were able to get Veterans Affairs Canada to cover their medical use. Not everyone, but if you go through a particular process and have some particular conditions, Veterans Affairs will cover the cost of cannabis for some vets, which is craziness. What about the rest of us?
Almost
So,
cannabis
President,
warriors.
let's all start expecting equal treatment under the law.
Yeah, we should. We should expect the same treatment under the law. But, the real world that we all live in is not so rosy. Anyone else?
When you were talking about terpenes, you mentioned the one lemon in the beginning of the name.
Yep.
And how it boosts the effectiveness and lets you take less of the drug so you don't get your medicine, so you don't get all drugged up.
Yeah.
Is that basically the same sort of thing that they found with grapefruit and antibiotics and such things?
Yeah, they're very similar things that, in nature, it's complicated because plants have hundreds and hundreds of molecules and they act in concert with their very complex physiology. But modern medicine is really focused on let's isolate individual components and let's target like specific proteins or let's poke into the specific membrane, which is important to find out the specific actions of specific molecules. But it is really not the bigger picture of how we exist and how our bodies operate and how they interact with the foods that we eat and the compounds that we ingest for medicine. The evidence is pretty clear that most people who consume, say, like marijuana, which is a THC pill, 100% THC, most people don't like it. Given the option of consuming whole cannabis versus a THC-only pill, almost everybody chooses whole cannabis because these compounds act together in a very complex fashion. And this is part of the reason why research is also difficult. Because when you're dealing with statistics and numbers, you have to control for a lot of the variables. And there are so many variables and so many interactions that it becomes very, very difficult to try to figure out, try to tease them all apart. But unfortunately, that's the way we work. Our reductionist attitude, it is important for research to break these things down, but it's an oversimplification. And because cannabis is so medically beneficial and is so less dangerous than almost everything out there, the hysteria around allowing people access and to try to see if it helps them, to me is just absurd. Almost everything else is far more dangerous, including caffeine. Caffeine is more dangerous than cannabis if you want to talk about toxic effects and death. Caffeine can lead to death, can lead to psychosis. Does cannabis? Cannabis can lead to psychosis. THC can, but it certainly doesn't lead to death. People can even go to the drugstore and get enough Tylenol to kill yourself. And by the way, I don't know if many people know this, but a lot of the non-steroid anti-inflammatory medications like ibuprofen, etc., they actually work by allowing your naturally occurring marijuana compound, anandamide. They basically allow that compound to float around for longer to give you pain relief and anti-inflammation. So, those drugs themselves, though, can kill you, right? If you take too much ibuprofen and stuff, it can hurt your intestines, gastrointestinal bleeding, and they're actually affecting the very same compounds that the plant does, but in a more dangerous way. And even a lot of doctors don't know that that's how they work.
I just wanted to go back to the whole legalization question and just more about politics and perhaps thinking about nationally when the vote happens, how we informed folks might be able to speed up legalization.
Yeah, well, obviously getting involved in some way, shape, or form. So for instance, in BC, there's Sensible BC. Some people are opposed to it because it's about decriminalization. But what people have to understand is that making political change is very difficult. And BC is actually the only province in Canada that actually allows for this kind of referendum where people can vote on things. And the only way they could move things forward was to actually make a baby step first. And obviously the whole intention is for eventual legalization, but Sensible BC right now is probably by far the best avenue that we have for direct change, because the Harper government, Harper said, not on my watch, it's not going to be legalized. Despite that though, in the last year or so, you may have noticed that they used to have a really hardcore stance on cannabis, and now they're talking about easing some of those up, talking about ticketing people instead of sending them to jail. That's a recent change, and that's a direct result of the groundswell from the population. And now we also have the Liberal Party, which, as part of their platform, they have a national legalization program. The Green Party also has a national legalization platform. Unfortunately, the NDP is only talking about decrim, which is bizarre, but there you have it. So under Harper, it's unlikely that legalization is going to happen unless his hand is forced by, for instance, the United States. Because, how long can the resistance occur? In 1996, one state had medical cannabis. Now, pretty soon, more than half of the population of the United States will live in states where there's a legal access, and as more and more states legalize, at what point does the government go, 50 states, or 25 states have now full legal use of cannabis. At what point does the government concede and go, okay?
DC.
Pardon me?
DC now has it.
Yeah, and DC does, which is crazy. The District of Columbia, where the White House is, has legal cannabis as well. So, yeah, the end is certainly nigh, but how long that is going to take, is anybody's guess. Like I said, I'm reluctant to make any kinds of estimates because all of the estimates have been proven wrong in the past.
I think we could speed it up by getting Harper out, getting Trudeau in.
For sure. However, it seems unlikely though. I completely agree with you, but it seems unlikely right now. We can hope.
Gotta show up at the polls.
Yes, everybody needs to vote, and people have to start talking about this kind of stuff and not be afraid of the stigma and the ridicule that you may encounter. And I admit, it's not always easy being these kinds of people who are the naysayers. When people spout their BS, we're the people who stand and go, actually, you might be mistaken about that, X, Y, and Z. It takes a toll on a person to stand up and get kicked in the face a lot, especially if you're confronted by health professionals, other professionals who, claim to know more than you or think that they do, and are unwilling to even look at the evidence. My experience has been that a lot of physicians are really, really reluctant, but those physicians who, they listen in the sense like, I've talked to a couple doctors about the anti-cancer properties of cannabis. Most, they kind of slough it off, especially years past. Now more and more are aware and are willing to listen, but in the past, they'd either laugh, but there were a couple doctors who were like, what? Because I was saying, these are studies published in, journals like Nature and Science. So these are top-tier journals, not some, fly-by-night journal. And some doctors were like, seriously? I was like, yes, and if you'd like, I can provide those to you. Any physician who has allowed me to send them information changes their mind because the evidence is overwhelming. And those who don't, it's clearly a case of just them putting the blinders on and making a choice not based on evidence, but based on their personal feelings.
Same with politicians.
Yeah, same with politicians, for sure. They're trying to keep their jobs. If they live in a place where their constituents are anti-pot, they're very unlikely to come out in favor of it because they will lose their jobs.
Well, pot narcs don't want to lose their jobs, so the best thing we can do is confront the government with the fact that they're done. They are the dinosaurs. They've got to go. We don't want them in our lives, hounding people, harassing. They're just not necessary anymore. So.
No, it's an absurd waste of financial resources and human potential. You know, probably preaching to the choir, probably everybody in here is aware that, you know, the United States...
The president, the government say, we won't tolerate that anymore.
Well, there are a lot of people saying that, but, you know, unfortunately, you know, like most protests and marches and stuff like that have zero impact, zero.
Well, I'll tell you what I did then.
Yeah.
A year ago, last spring, I had watched Breaking Bad from the library, so no commercials. I watched the whole series, the whole thing twice.
Yeah.
And then I wrote 3 short stories all about knocking off pot narcs and sent them to Health Canada last spring. And 2 weeks later, they started changing the law on that.
I think it might have been, yay you! I think it might have been coincidental though.
No, believe me, it's not. I've had a lot of correspondence with those people.
Okay.
They know who they're getting it from.
Oh no, I'm not saying that, but were they saying that your letters were directly responsible for the
I just
changes in
find
policy?
that when I write something out to a government body, it's always like 2 weeks later, there's a massive change.
Well, then, if that's the case, then you better start writing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But the reality is the real change comes with politics, unfortunately. And not all of us are cut out for politics. It's not my cup of tea, not my bag. But after you've been in the game for a while and trying to create any kind of social justice change, you discover that the real meat and potatoes is getting involved in politics. And it's also why some things don't move forward, because for a lot of us who are contrarian or anti-establishment because we see the way the world really works, who wants to get involved in that? But unfortunately, somebody has to, which are the Dana Larsons, who, Sensible BC, and the people like Mark Emery, very polarizing and controversial figure, but as far as policies around cannabis, he's right. But it takes a special kind of person, and I am not that person. I just can't do it, and a lot of people
standing
can.
up here talking to us.
Yeah, this is totally different than being involved in politics, and let me tell you.
Yeah, they hurt your life. They do. You got to have nothing to lose.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to compliment you on an excellent presentation. And the second is a question more about yourself. You mentioned that you've had experience in addictions counseling and work, and I'd like to know where you did that, and also, how do you make your living?
So,
because that doesn't mention in any of the information.
Sure. So, I worked with at-risk youth, so I worked in group homes, and I'm from Kelowna. Mm-hmm. And I also worked in a recovery house that catered to male drug addicts only.
Which one?
Bedford Place. Bedford House, through ARC programs.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, not through ARC programs. I was the at-risk youth through the John Howard Society in Kelowna. Yeah. And currently, actually, it's a complicated story. I was in Vancouver for a year and a half. Working with the Herb Museum, and actually was there initially to try to set up another dispensary with a very well-known activist. And unfortunately, it was actually during the time when the announcement of the changes to the medical marijuana regulations came in. So at the time in Vancouver, most of the landlords were reluctant because there was this change coming and nobody really knew what was going to happen. I was there for a year and a half. We did the Herb Museum. I have a number of medical conditions. I went legally blind in my left eye. I had to have a corneal transplant. And I came back to Kelowna. And since that time, since I've been back, 40 dispensaries have opened in Vancouver. While I was there for a year and a half, maybe only 2 or 3 opened. And right now, actually, funnily enough, I'm actually currently unemployed. I do a little bit of research and writing because the guy I was in Vancouver with to set up a dispensary, he actually has since been able to open a dispensary in the last couple months, so I've been doing some work for him. But part of the health problems I went through, etc., led to me having to leave the position. And then I was working for a couple years, and I got laid off actually a little while ago. So right now I'm actually currently in transition. Here first with the beard.
So expanding on that, when's the last time you used cannabis and for what purpose?
The last time I used cannabis was about a half hour before I came here.
Me too.
And I use for a whole host of reasons, primarily for mood stabilization. I deal with depression and anxiety, and I also have some physical conditions like I have an eye disease called keratoconus. I also have arthritis. I have a mild scoliosis in my spine, so I have, and also some arthritis in my neck and spine, so I use it for that as well.
Question,
Yes,
do you have a cell phone?
I do.
I have some information for you and anyone else that's interested. I've learned after I heard retired Canadian Air Force Captain, former Director of Electronic Warfare, Jerry Flynn, speak in in Slocan Park, a year or so ago. I realized that I myself had been electrosensitive, and it became extreme following the Executive Flight Center Fuel Services spill into Lemon Creek in July of 2013. And we've since learned that industry-biased, unsafe, toxic levels of radio frequency and cell phone signals may contribute to the whole spectrum of health disorders. And when we understand that cannabis itself historically has been used as a remedy for radiation sickness, it all becomes clear.
Yeah, sure. I pick up your info.
Yes, and feel free to make copies of this and share it amongst yourselves. It's cutting edge, new information from electronic engineer Stephen McGee in Arizona, who's speaking out about this and outraged that the U.S. government is also hiding and covering up this unfortunate reality. Unsafe, industry-biased levels of toxic radio frequencies and cell phone signals and so forth, Wi-Fi. The remedy is simply to get back on a cord, get away from the wireless stuff.
Yeah, so if anybody wants that info, you can pick it up. I think it's kind of a pipe dream to think that we're going to exist in a world without Wi-Fi, unless, of course, everything crashes. But if things continue the way they are, I don't see how that's going to be possible. And for people who want to, live off the land, all the power to you. But there's 7 billion of us on the planet. That's clearly not going to work out for the vast majority of us. Yes.
So both you and him took words out of my head as I was listening to you. U.S. government, here's a pipe dream for you. The current president of the United States, he's a lame duck. So he can go off and do things that he wouldn't normally do because he doesn't have to worry about getting reelected. This is why he's doing this thing with Cuba, for instance. But he's also a self-admitted stoner from his teenage years. Mm-hmm. He didn't just inhale, he was a stoner. Right? Maybe in his last year and a half of presidency, people could put pressure on him to make it legal. Like, do it nationally. Because what the heck? He doesn't have to worry about getting reelected.
Well, the wrong country. We don't live in the States.
Ah, yeah, but the way the States go, so do we.
And I hear what you're saying, and I believe that there is a lot of pressure being put on the government and on Obama himself because of his past. The normal National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in the United States, they've been pressuring for 40 years, and their biggest advances have come just in the last few years, and I think obviously a lot more is to come in a relatively short period of time, and not just in North America. I think globally, lots of countries, because of the state, those states legalizing, have started basically saying, you don't have the moral authority to tell us what to do anymore, because most of the rest of the world, they comply with international drug laws that were forced on them, in essence, by the United States. Basically, the United States went to the UN and forced them to adopt particular drug policies, and a lot of aid that is given to countries in distress or when destroyed is contingent upon them signing on to some of these drug policies. And of course, they pay for these policies in blood. Mexico is a disaster. They're close to being a failed state. Many of you may not be aware that the drug trafficking cartels that predominate in the United States, and as violent as they are, they've actually, almost completely taken over other Latin American countries like Honduras and Ecuador. Sorry, not Ecuador. Can't remember now. But anyways, other ones where there's even less infrastructure than in Mexico, and most people don't hear anything about what's going on there. And this is a destabilizing aspect for the entire planet. Some of the cartels are so powerful, both financially and with military power, that they actually are a direct threat to the existing military in the countries, as well as a direct threat to militaries in other countries. And not to mention the fact that a lot of what they do is, money or lead, right? You either take our bribe and do what we say, or we kill you, and they're not kidding around. Most people decide to live. Most of us would as well. And that leads to corruption everywhere at every level. And, my wife and I were actually just watching a short little documentary on CBC about the cartels. And, the US government denying that they've ever been in bed with the Sinaloa cartel and favor one over the other and, feed them one off the other. But if you look at court transcripts, lots and lots of investigative journalists, it's very, very clear that, like happens everywhere. In order to get the big king, you often let little things go by. So if you want to get one drug cartel, you'll often work with another. And you may not intend it, but the consequences are the same. They get a free pass while this one gets shut down. And the Sinaloa cartel, one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico, has in fact been able to do that. They've had high-ranking cartel members who turn informant or a double agent type of thing, where they pass off information in exchange for money and in exchange for a free pass. We will let these guns and drugs be smuggled and sold if you do this for us. And of course, the unintended consequences are disastrous.
Just one more thing about Harper.
Oh, just hang on, the gentleman in the back.
How available is the hempcrete now in Canada?
A lot of these products are, they're not widely available because it's difficult to get a license to grow cannabis even for hemp purpose, for fiber purposes. But it's growing by leaps and bounds. In fact, a lot of major companies like BMW and stuff are starting to reintroduce hemp in their upholstery and also plant resins and products for the manufacture of some plastics and stuff. And this is just going to continue to explode because of the clear benefits to growing and using cannabis for all sorts of purposes.
Are they going to be growing it in Canada for those purposes too? Like,
Yeah, for sure.
Saskatchewan, for...
Yeah, for sure. There are companies that are working on some of these products in Canada. And there are some places that have been built with hempcrete in Canada. Currently, you can only build smaller buildings with hempcrete. They're working on, and actually I should be honest about this. I don't currently know because the last I looked into this aspect was a couple years ago. And at that time, they were working on reinforcing the hempcrete so that they could build taller buildings. But there's, for instance, a display home that is built with hempcrete. And literally everything in the house, the furniture, upholstery, the carpets, everything is made from hemp except for the windows and the nails, etc.
Has it gone through CSA and UL? Because that would be the thing for standards, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't want. I don't know about that. But going into the future, I think it's pretty clear and inevitable that hemp will be more and more embraced, and more products will be discovered and invented for its use as we are able to actually do a lot more legitimate research with the plant.
Christmas, I bought this hoodie. It's 55% hemp, 45% cotton. And the nice thing about it is I have a lot of computers at home. There's no static problems with natural fibers. Normal fleece stuff that you get.
That's true.
Yeah, the normal fleece stuff made of plastic bottles, recycled plastic bottles, Wintertime, it's a big static generator, it kills equipment like that. This stuff, I never get a shock.
Nice.
Nice benefit.
Our electronic devices interfere with our body's natural millivolt system. The external radio frequencies travel along the surface of our skin and interference. Called induction.
Yes.
I'm wondering how long the movie is.
Yes.
It's getting late, and I don't know how much longer.
Mhm.
So I think the movie is approximately 1 hour. It's quite short. So if we can wrap up questions maybe in the next 5 minutes, take a 10-minute break and hit the movie, we'll be good.
Does that sound good for everyone? Or do you want to get the movie going right now? All right. I think people want the movie now.
All right, let's do it. So just sit tight, we'll throw the movie on.